In May 2024, when Joe Biden was still in the White House, when Donald Trump was still fighting criminal charges, and when most of the media class was still saying there would be no war with Iran, I made three predictions. I said Trump would return. I said the United States would go to war with Iran. And I said America would lose that war and that the loss would permanently change the global order. Two of those predictions already came true. Trump returned. America went to war with Iran. So now the only question that matters is whether the third prediction was dramatic theater or simple diagnosis. My answer is that it was diagnosis because I was not reading personality. I was not reading campaign slogans. I was not reading one speech, one poll, or one headline. I was reading structure. I was reading incentives. I was reading the old patterns that keep returning when an empire is still strong enough to punish, but no longer strong enough to turn punishment into a stable political outcome. That is the real story here. The United States is on course to lose this war, not because it cannot bomb Iran. It is on course to lose because bombing Iran is the one thing it can still do most easily. And bombing is no longer enough to produce the kind of victory Washington actually needs. That distinction is everything. If you understand that, the ending stops looking mysterious, it starts looking logical. The method is simple. First, I look at structure, then I look at incentives, then I look at history, not because history repeats line by line, but because the deeper patterns of empire, fear, overreach, and exhaustion repeat more often than people want to admit. That is predictive history. Not prophecy, not mysticism, not confidence for its own sake structure, incentives, historical pattern. So let us start there. What does America say it wants? It says it wants to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. It says it wants stability. It says it wants peace and security in the Middle East. That is the public language. But what does America actually want? America wants to preserve control over the global oil system because the global oil system still supports the petrodollar, and the petrodollar still supports American financial power since the 1970s. Oil being traded in dollars has created permanent global demand for the American currency. That demand is one of the hidden pillars of American empire. It helps Washington finance deficits, sustain military reach, and preserve a level of global power that would otherwise be much harder to carry. So strip away the speeches, and the deeper American interest becomes obvious. Control the energy arteries, preserve the petrodollar, preserve the empire built on both. That is what America actually wants. Now look at Iran. Iran says it wants the blockade lifted. It wants its frozen assets released. It wants its sovereignty respected. It wants a settlement that does not humiliate it. All of that is true. But what does Iran actually want? First, survival. That is the base layer for decades. The United States has tried to isolate, squeeze, weaken, or transform the Iranian state. Tehran watched Iraq collapse. It watched Libya get destroyed. It watched Syria get shredded. It understands a lesson that many outsiders still refuse to absorb. If it does not resist, it does not get peace, it gets dismantled. So survival comes first, but survival is not enough. Iran also wants recognition. It wants to emerge from this war, not merely alive, but established as a permanent regional power. It wants sanctions to end not as a temporary favor, but as recognition that Iran cannot simply be erased from the strategic map. It wants the Strait of Hormuz not only as a temporary wartime lever, but as a lasting instrument of economic relevance. And it wants its allies in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and beyond, protected as part of whatever settlement comes next. Now, look at Israel. Israel says it wants security. It says it wants Iran contained or neutralized. That is true. But again, it is not deep enough. Israel wants to prove that it can be the most disciplined, technologically advanced, strategically capable actor in the region. It is not only fighting for security, it is also auditioning for a larger role in a Middle East where American staying power is no longer unlimited. It wants the people who actually run systems, the financial elite, the strategic elite, the people who think in decades, to look at it and conclude that when the old empire weakens, this is the actor that can still impose order. Then there are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait. They want survival too. They want exports to continue. They want regimes to endure. They want to be close to whoever proves strongest. They do not want to be crushed between bigger powers. They are not writing the script of this war. They are trying not to be buried inside it. So those are the players. Now ask the second question, what does structure allow? Because interests alone never decide outcomes. Structure determines which interests can actually be sustained. The first structural fact is this: America can dominate the air war. That part is obvious. The United States still has overwhelming air superiority, deep surveillance, enormous strike capacity, and the ability to destroy above ground targets far faster than Iran can destroy American power in conventional terms. It can hit infrastructure, it can target leadership compounds, it can damage production, it can keep tightening the pressure from the air, but that does not mean it can win the war. This is one of the clearest truths in modern military history. Air power can punish, It can terrorize, it can degrade, it can isolate. What it repeatedly struggles to do is create durable political transformation by itself. North Vietnam did not surrender because it was bombed. Germany did not surrender because bombing alone ended its will. A large prepared. A determined country does not simply dissolve because another state dominates the sky. That leads directly to the second structural fact. America has no clean path to a ground victory in Iran. Iran is not Iraq. It is not Libya. It is not a small, flat battlefield waiting to be cut apart. It is a large, mountainous country with a huge population, long prepared underground infrastructure, decentralized missile and drone systems, and a military culture shaped by decades of anticipation. Iran has spent a quarter century preparing for the possibility that one day the United States might try to finish the job. You do not invade a state like that and get a quick solution. You get a long war, a dirty war, an expensive war, a war whose political costs begin accumulating faster than its strategic gains. That is why my first direct prediction remains simple. There will be no full-scale American ground invasion of Iran. Troops can move, Marines can posture, options can be prepared, threats can be made, but an actual invasion would mean casualties, money, and time on a scale the American political system does not want to bear. It would threaten Trump's presidency. It would raise the specter of a draft. It would push the country into exactly the kind of war modern America has repeatedly failed to sustain. Everyone serious inside Washington understands this. The third structural fact is the cost exchange. Iran does not need to match American spending. It only needs to keep producing pain more cheaply than Washington can suppress it. Drones, missiles, swarms, decentralized production, distributed launch systems. The American response to these systems is vastly more expensive than the systems themselves. A stronger power can absorb a bad exchange ratio for a short war. It cannot build a whole strategy on one. The fourth structural fact is economic. Hormuz carries around 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Yemen's ability to threaten Red Sea traffic compounds the strain. When both arteries are unstable at the same time, the war stops being merely regional. It becomes a global inflation engine. Oil rises, shipping costs rise, fertilizer rises, food pressure rises, political anger rises, and that matters most in one place, America, because America's real vulnerability in this war is not military capacity. It is political pain tolerance. The United States can absorb military expenditure more easily than it can absorb a furious population asking why gasoline is higher, why groceries cost more, why markets are unstable, and why the war still has no clear victory story after so much force has already been used. Iran understands that perfectly well. That is not a side note. It is the logic of the whole Iranian strategy. Tehran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. In a conventional sense, it needs to keep the war expensive enough, ambiguous enough, and politically irritating enough that Washington begins searching for a face. Saving exit before Tehran's own system collapses. That is how weaker states fight stronger empires, not by overpowering them, by outlasting their political patience. Now, if that were the whole story, Iran would still be in very serious trouble because the pressure is real, the bombing is real, the damage is real, the sanctions are real. So the crucial question becomes this: if Iran is under so much pressure, why has it not already buckled? Why can it still keep choosing? Why can it still decide when to tighten, when to bargain, when to threaten, when to wait? The answer is not mystery. The answer is that pain has not yet become collapse. That distinction is the whole war. Too many people confuse the two. Pain means a country is suffering. Collapse means it can no longer make meaningful choices. Iran is in pain, but Iran has not collapsed. It still has enough endurance, enough depth, and enough leverage to keep making choices. And once a target state can still make choices, the war changes. Washington is no longer dealing with a country that must accept terms immediately or die. It is dealing with a country that is hurt, damaged, strained, but still capable of deciding when to negotiate and when to refuse. That is what makes this war so dangerous for the United States. Washington can still dominate the opening phase. What it cannot easily do is convert that dominance into a clean political ending at a price its own system is willing to bear. And that leads directly to the only question that matters. Now, how does this end? I think there are three real paths. The first is the thin deal path. In this scenario, economic pain keeps rising. Diplomatic channels remain open, and Iran accepts a narrower framework before the current window closes. Frozen assets become part of the hinge. A formula is found, a number is found. America says force worked. Iran says sovereignty was preserved. The headlines call it de-escalation. The deeper truth is that the war gets frozen, not solved. This path is real. In fact, it is what many mediators want. But even in this outcome, The key point remains, Iran does not simply surrender Hormuz. At most, it accepts some managed form of passage that preserves a role in how the corridor is used, routed, or politically interpreted. Washington calls that restored navigation. Tehran calls that managed authority. Both sides describe the same arrangement differently. The second path is the breakdown path. Talks fail, the ceasefire collapses, bombing resumes. But the second round is not just the first round repeated. The first round damaged the system. It also taught every side what still survived. Networks get patched, infrastructure gets rerouted, underground capacity becomes even more valuable. The war becomes harsher, more expensive, more desperate. No one publicly wants this path, but every false reading of temporary calm as real resolution makes it more likely. The third path is the long ceasefire path. No grand peace, no clean treaty, no iconic ending, just a prolonged freeze that slowly hardens into reality because the alternatives are too costly. Oil matters too much. Outside powers will not tolerate endless disruption. And nobody wants to admit that the conflict is not really solved so much as parked. This may in fact be the most likely path because it allows every major player to claim something. America can claim deterrence. Iran can claim survival and strategic relevance. Israel can claim it proved its military value. The Gulf states can claim continuity, and the wider world can claim it prevented a total breakdown of the energy system. But even if that is how it ends, the underlying lesson is the same. The United States can still dominate the opening phase of wars like this. What it cannot do at a sustainable price is turn that superiority into uncontested political meaning. That is the larger historical question here. Not simply whether America can bomb, it can. Not simply whether America can destroy, it can. The question is whether America can still convert overwhelming force into a clean political outcome. When the enemy is resilient, the geography is hostile, the cost exchange is bad, and the global economy begins punishing Washington. Its own patience faster than Washington can impose its will. That is the deeper pattern. And it is why I think the public conversation remains one full layer too shallow. People keep asking whether Iran blinked. That is the wrong question. The better question is whether this war has already exposed something much bigger. America is trying to solve a conflict with 20th century assumptions about power in a world where its enemies no longer need to beat it militarily in order to make victory unaffordable. That is the analytical correction we need. This is not prophecy. It is structure. It is incentive. It is the logic of empire under pressure. And that is why the ending of this war is becoming easier to see. America can dominate the opening phase. It can punish. It can degrade. It can strike. What it cannot do at a price its own political system is willing to bear is turn that superiority into a clean ending on its own terms. And when an empire reaches that point, the ending may still take time, but the direction is already visible. That is the real story here. Not simply war, not simply Iran, but the visible beginning of an American retreat from a region it can still damage, but no longer shaped by itself